When a powerful billionaire rushes his sick daughter to the hospital on a snowy night, he never expects the pediatrician walking through the door to be his ex-wife, the woman he lost to ambition and regret. What begins as a desperate night of fear turns into a journey of forgiveness, rediscovery, and second chances. As old wounds reopen and love fights its way back through the cracks, one little girl's innocence becomes the bridge that heals two broken hearts. Watch till the end to feel the warmth of redemption, the power of family, and the magic of love that refuses to fade. If you believe everyone deserves a second chance, like, share, and subscribe, because some stories remind us that home isn't a place, it's the people who choose to stay. Snow fell in slow, silent spirals outside the glass walls of the Montgomery Tower, each flake catching the blue glow of the city lights below. Inside, the office was still and sterile, a glass kingdom built on ambition. Caspian Montgomery sat behind his desk, a man whose life was measured in profits and deadlines, not heartbeats. The clock on the wall struck 9, but he didn't move. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, untouched, forgotten. It was Christmas Eve, but to him it was just another night to conquer silence. The faint vibration of his phone shattered the stillness. At first, he ignored it, eyes fixed on a contract glowing on his tablet screen. Then the second call came, urgent, persistent. He frowned and answered, his voice cool and practiced. "Yes, Eleanor?" His assistant's voice trembled on the other end. "Sir, it's about Amelia. The nanny just called. She's burning up, high fever, and she's been vomiting for an hour. The pediatric clinic's closed for the holiday. You need to take her to the ER." For the first time in years, Caspian's composure cracked. The tablet slid from his hand. "Which hospital?" he demanded. His pulse thundered. "Boston General, sir. They're expecting you." He didn't wait to end the call. His mind was already somewhere else, rushing down corridors that existed only in memory, back to the night Amelia was born. He had been halfway across the world then, closing a deal, in Tokyo, while his ex-wife, cried alone in a delivery room. He told himself he did it for the family. But that excuse had dissolved years ago, just like the marriage. Within minutes, he was in the elevator, the mirrored walls reflecting a stranger in an expensive coat and haunted eyes. By the time he reached the parking lot, the snow had thickened into a curtain of white. He hadn't driven himself in years. There had always been someone to open the door, someone to steer for him. But tonight, he gripped the wheel with shaking hands, the city's lights blurring through the frost. Each red light felt like a test of how much a man could regret. By the time he reached the hospital, his daughter's soft breathing in the backseat had become labored. He lifted her into his arms, clutching her small body close. Her skin burned against the cold night air. "Daddy's here," he whispered, the words tasting foreign, but real. The automatic doors hissed open to a rush of antiseptic air and murmured voices. Inside, fluorescent lights painted everything too bright, too sharp. A nurse at the desk looked up and gasped softly at the sight of him. She knew his name. Everyone did. But the worry in his eyes made him just another father tonight. She pointed him down the corridor. "Room 3, sir. Dr. Hale is on call." The name made him pause. Hale. It couldn't be. His throat went dry as he followed the nurse. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the rhythmic beeping of monitors echoing like a heartbeat he didn't trust. He pushed the door open, and there she was. Delphine stood by the bed, her auburn hair pulled back, her blue scrubs crisp beneath the sterile light. Time had deepened her beauty, softened her strength. She turned at the sound of the door, and the world stopped moving. Her eyes met his, and for a long, unbearable second neither breathed. Her stethoscope hung forgotten around her neck. "Caspian," she said quietly, disbelief threading through her voice. He couldn't speak. He could only lower his gaze to the bed where Amelia lay, cheeks flushed, small hands clutching the blanket. "She got worse," he managed. "I didn't know who else to call." Delphine moved closer, her voice steady but her eyes betraying something deeper. "You did the right thing." She placed a gentle hand on their daughter's forehead. Then, turned to him with a professional calm that didn't reach her trembling fingers. "We'll take care of her." He nodded, but his gaze lingered on her longer than it should have. The air between them felt charged, heavy with things left unsaid. Apologies, memories, the ghosts of what they once were. Delphine looked at him again, and for just a flicker of a moment, her mask slipped. "You... here?" she whispered, almost to herself. Caspian wanted to say something, anything, but all that came out was a breath that sounded too much like regret. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and endless. Inside, 3 lives that had once been torn apart found themselves in the same small room again, the air thick with past and possibility. Neither of them knew it yet, but this night, the fever, the fear, the meeting they never saw coming, would change everything. The hospital corridor was quiet now, the storm outside muffling the world to a hush. The hour between night and dawn had its own kind of magic, a fragile calm that belonged only to those who hadn't slept. Caspian sat beside his daughter's bed, the glow of the monitor casting soft light across her small, flushed face. Her breathing was steadier now, the fever finally breaking. But he couldn't bring himself to relax. Each rise and fall of her chest was a reminder of how fragile she was, how easily everything he'd built could mean nothing in a single heartbeat. Delphine moved silently through the room, adjusting IV lines, checking vitals, her motions efficient but careful. He watched her from his chair, unable to stop his eyes from tracing the lines of her face. The years had not dulled her, only changed. There was strength in her, and a quiet exhaustion that came from saving too many lives while losing her own peace. "You should get some rest," she said softly, not looking at him. Her voice was calm, professional, but something in it trembled just slightly. "I can't," he said. "Not while she's like this." Delphine finally looked up, her eyes tired but kind. "You used to say that about work," she replied, a faint trace of a smile ghosting across her lips. Caspian exhaled, leaning back. "Maybe that's why I lost everything that mattered." The room fell into a heavy silence, filled only by the hum of machines and the distant echo of a paging announcement down the hall. Delphine finished her notes and set the clipboard aside. For a moment her hand brushed Amelia's forehead again, soft and lingering, and then she sat in the chair across from him. "She'll be okay," she said after a while. "Her temperature's down. It's just the flu, nothing dangerous. She'll sleep through the night." "Thank God," he murmured. He looked down at his daughter, the tiny person who somehow carried pieces of both of them. "She's grown so fast. I missed so much." Delphine's eyes softened, though she tried to hide it. "She still asks about you, you know. When she sees something on TV about Montgomery Pharmaceuticals, she says that's my daddy's company. But she doesn't understand why her daddy isn't home." Caspian's throat tightened. "I wanted to come by more, every time I thought about it, I didn't know if I was welcome." She hesitated, then said quietly, "You weren't unwelcome, Caspian. You were just late." He winced at the truth in her words. Late. Too late to fix their marriage. Too late to be there when Amelia said her first word. Too late to stop the distance that turned love into silence. The faint sound of snow tapping against the window filled the pause that followed. Delphine looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching for something. Maybe regret, maybe sincerity. "Why did you come yourself tonight?" she asked finally. "You could have sent someone, you always do." He looked at her, and for once there was no pretense. "Because there was no one else I trusted." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Not with her." Delphine's breath caught and she looked away quickly, pretending to adjust the monitor again. "She'll be fine," she repeated, though her hands were trembling now. "Delphine," he began, but she cut him off gently. "Don't," she said. "Not tonight." He nodded, accepting the boundary but unable to stop the ache in his chest. He watched her check on their daughter again, her touch steady, her heart visible in every careful motion. The woman he once loved The woman he never stopped loving stood a few feet away and might as well have been 1,000 miles distant. As the clock ticked past 2 in the morning, Delphine settled into the chair by the window, exhaustion pulling at her. Caspian stayed by the bed, his hand resting on Amelia's small one. They sat in silence, two people tethered by a child and by a past that refused to fade. At one point, Amelia stirred, eyes fluttering open. She looked at both of them through heavy lashes and whispered, "Mommy, Daddy, are you staying?" Delphine's gaze flicked to Caspian, uncertainty flickering between them. He didn't hesitate. He leaned close to his daughter and said softly, "We're not going anywhere, sweetheart. We'll be right here." Amelia smiled faintly, her tiny fingers curling around both their hands before she drifted back to sleep. Delphine didn't say anything. She just looked at their joined hands for a long, trembling moment before letting her own remain there. The snow outside thickened, covering the city in white. Inside that small room, time seemed to stop, just a man, a woman, and the daughter who unknowingly pulled them both back into the same orbit they'd once destroyed. Neither of them dared to speak it aloud, but they both felt it. Something fragile, something buried deep beneath years of pain, had just begun to stir again. Morning came softly through the frosted hospital window, painting the room in shades of pale gold and silver. The blizzard had passed overnight, leaving a quiet stillness that felt almost unreal. Caspian stirred awake in the chair beside Amelia's bed, his neck stiff, his coat still draped over his shoulders. For a moment he didn't remember where he was. Then he heard the faint rhythmic beeping, the scent of disinfectant and the small sound of his daughter's breathing, and everything came rushing back. Amelia's cheeks were no longer flushed with fever. Her small fingers twitched beneath the blanket, her lips parting as she murmured something in her sleep. Caspian reached forward and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, marveling at how something so tiny could command the whole world to stop. He'd given his life to numbers, contracts, power, but this little girl was the only equation that ever truly mattered, and somehow he'd never learned how to solve it. The door creaked open quietly. Delphine stepped in, holding a clipboard and a paper cup of coffee. She looked tired, but in that way only doctors could, steady, purposeful, still standing after everyone else had fallen. When she saw him awake, she hesitated. The air between them was still fragile, held together by unspoken rules neither dared to break. "She's responding well," Delphine said softly. "Temperature's normal. We'll monitor her a few more hours, but she should be fine to go home today." Caspian exhaled, relief washing over him. "Thank you," he murmured, meaning it more than he could ever express. Delphine set the clipboard down and crossed to Amelia's bedside. She smiled faintly as she checked the girl's pulse. "She's strong," she said, almost to herself. "Just like her mother," Caspian replied quietly. Delphine froze for a fraction of a second, her eyes flicking up to his. "She gets that from you too," she said at last, her tone unreadable. Then she stepped back, straightened her coat, and tried to build the wall again. Caspian stood, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "I don't know how you do this," he said. "These nights. The hours. The pressure." She gave a small, tired laugh. "You build empires, Caspian. I build moments that matter. It's the same madness in a different shape." That line stayed with him. He didn't know if she meant it as a jab or as truth. Maybe both. They both turned when Amelia stirred, blinking awake. "Mommy?" she whispered, voice small and groggy. Delphine smiled and took her hand. "Hey, sweetheart. You scared us for a bit?" Amelia's gaze drifted to her father. "Daddy stayed all night," she said softly, surprise in her tone. Caspian smiled, brushing her hand gently. "I wasn't going anywhere." Delphine looked at him, and something flickered in her expression. A memory, maybe, or disbelief that he'd actually kept his word for once. By afternoon, the discharge papers were ready. Delphine handed them to Caspian in the hallway. Their fingers brushed for the briefest moment. The touch burned like the memory of something neither of them dared to name. "Make sure she rests," Delphine said. "Plenty of fluids, and don't let her run around just yet." "I can handle that," Caspian said with a small, crooked smile. "I'm better at following orders these days." Delphine almost smiled back but stopped herself. "I'll believe that when I see it," she murmured. Amelia came running, or as much as her wobbly legs allowed, and grabbed both their hands. "Can we all go home together?" she asked. The words hit harder than she could ever understand. Delphine glanced at Caspian. Hesitation etched into every line of her face. "Sweetheart," she began gently, "Mommy has to stay at the hospital tonight. There are other children who need her." Amelia's lips trembled. "Just for today," Caspian said quietly. "Come with us. We'll make sure she rests. You can check on her later." Delphine looked between them, at her daughter's hopeful eyes, at the man she once loved and feared to trust again. Something inside her shifted. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe longing, maybe the echo of all the Christmases that had felt too empty. She sighed. "Just one day," she whispered. Amelia's joy lit up the hallway. She squeezed both their hands tight. "All three of us again," she said. Delphine blinked back sudden warmth in her eyes. She told herself it was only for Amelia's sake, that nothing more could come of this. But as they stepped out into the crisp winter light, the snow glinting on the car's roof, and Caspian opened the door for them like he used to, something in her heart dared to beat the way it once did. The drive was quiet. Amelia hummed in the back seat, half asleep. Caspian stole a glance at Delphine beside him, her profile framed against the pale sunlight. She wasn't wearing her ring anymore, but the faint mark where it once sat was still visible. He didn't know if this day meant anything beyond a truce, but as their daughter's small voice broke the silence, "Daddy, are we going to be a family again?" Neither of them could answer. Delphine looked out the window. Caspian gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, and for the first time in years, hope didn't feel impossible. It just felt dangerous. The cabin stood at the edge of Lake Serenity, its windows glowing softly against the snow-draped pines. The storm had passed, leaving the world in stillness like breath held between heartbeats. Caspian carried the last of the bags inside, his hands stiff from the cold, his heart uncertain of what he was walking into. Delphine was already tending to the fireplace, coaxing the flame to life with the same patience she used on frightened children in the hospital. The crackle of burning wood filled the silence between them, a silence that had weight and memory. Amelia sat cross-legged on the couch, wrapped in a blanket with tiny stars on it, her cheeks rosy from the drive. "This place looks like Christmas," she said, eyes wide as she watched the fire dance. Caspian smiled and knelt beside her. "That's the idea. Warm, safe, and full of pancakes." She giggled and tugged on Delphine's sleeve. "Mommy, Daddy said pancakes." Delphine shot him a look, half amusement, half warning. "You're making them then," she said. He raised his hands in surrender. "Deal." For the first time, a spark of laughter passed between them without the weight of the past pressing too hard. Outside, the world was white and endless. Inside, warmth crept slowly back into the corners of their hearts. Caspian watched as Delphine moved through the small kitchen, her hair loose now catching the firelight. He remembered the mornings years ago when she would hum under her breath while stirring coffee, when they had still believed they had forever. The sound of the whisk against the bowl brought those mornings back like ghosts. Amelia's laughter echoed as she chased their old dog through the living room. Delphine's gaze softened. "She's happy here," she said quietly. Caspian nodded. "She's happiest when it feels like home." The day passed gently. They built a snowman just outside the porch, Amelia insisting it needed a doctor's stethoscope and a business tie so it could be both of them together. Delphine laughed until tears filled her eyes, and even Caspian joined in, his gloves covered in snow. For a moment, they were simply a family again. No past, no mistakes, just laughter melting into the wind. As dusk began to fall, the lake turned silver under the dying light. Amelia ran ahead, her small boots crunching through the frost, her breath puffing out in clouds. "Don't go too far," Caspian called, but she only turned and waved. Delphine followed, smiling, until her foot slipped on the icy edge of the lake. Caspian reacted before thinking, catching her by the arm, pulling her against him. The world narrowed to the sound of her heartbeat against his chest. Her breath trembling. "Still clumsy," he whispered, trying to mask how hard his own heart was pounding. She looked up at him, her voice barely a breath. "And you still like saving me." For a moment, everything stilled. The air between them burned warmer than the fire behind the cabin. He wanted to say that he'd never stopped wanting to, but the words tangled somewhere in his throat. Delphine stepped back quickly, her cheeks flushed from more than the cold. "We should go inside," she said. Later, after Amelia was tucked in and the house had gone quiet, Caspian found her sitting by the fireplace again, staring into the flames. He sat across from her, the firelight flickering between them like an unspoken truth. "You built something good here," she said. "A life, stability. She's safe with you." He shook his head. "I built walls. Safety isn't the same as happiness." Delphine's expression softened, but her tone stayed careful. "You can't fix the past, Caspian. And I can't forget it." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I don't want to fix it. I want to start from here." She looked at him for a long time, and for the first time in years he saw tears gathering in her eyes. "You say that like it's easy," she whispered. "I know it's not," he said. "But maybe it's worth it." Before she could reply, the phone on the counter vibrated sharply, its screen lighting the dim room. Delphine's name flashed on the caller ID from the hospital. She hesitated, her jaw tightening. Another emergency. Another child in danger. Caspian's voice was low. "Don't answer." Her eyes met his, torn between duty and longing. "You know I have to." He stood, frustration and heartbreak mingling in his chest. "And when do you have to choose us?" The silence that followed was the loudest sound in the room. The fire cracked. The phone kept buzzing. Finally, Delphine reached for it, her fingers trembling. "I'm sorry," she whispered. She grabbed her coat and moved toward the door. Caspian didn't stop her. He just watched as she disappeared into the snow, the light from her car fading into the white distance. When the sound of the engine was gone, he sat back down beside the fire, staring into the place she'd been sitting. Upstairs, Amelia stirred and murmured softly, "Mommy?" Caspian looked up at the ceiling, his throat tightening. "She had to help someone," he whispered. "She'll be back." But the truth sat heavy in his chest, bitter and familiar. He wasn't sure if this time she would be. Outside, the lake was frozen and still, holding its secrets beneath the ice, waiting for spring to decide if things buried deep could ever truly thaw. The snow had stopped by morning, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than before. Caspian sat at the cabin's kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold. The fire had burned down to embers, soft orange glows that reminded him of everything he didn't know how to keep alive. The house was too still without Delphine's footsteps, too hollow without her quiet humming. Upstairs, Amelia's laughter echoed faintly through the walls as she played with her dolls, the only light sound in the emptiness. He hadn't slept. Not really. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Delphine's taillights fading into the white storm. She had said she was sorry, but the word had carried a familiar finality. He couldn't even be angry. She was saving another child, doing what she was made for. But some stubborn part of him kept whispering that maybe she was saving herself from him again. The clock ticked toward noon before he finally heard the crunch of tires outside. He stood before he even realized he'd moved, heart pounding in a way he hadn't felt in years. The door opened, cold air sweeping in before Delphine stepped through. Her hair was damp from melted snow, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. She looked like someone who'd fought through the night, and maybe she had. Amelia came running down the stairs before he could speak. "Mommy!" she cried, throwing her arms around her. Delphine dropped her bag and held her close, her chin trembling against her daughter's hair. "I missed you so much, sweetheart." Caspian stood there, unsure if he should speak, unsure if he even had the right. When Delphine finally looked up, their eyes met, and for a heartbeat the distance between them felt smaller. "She's fine," he said quietly. "She missed you." "I missed her too," Delphine replied. Her voice was steady, but her eyes glistened. "And you?" he asked before he could stop himself. She hesitated, brushing a tear from Amelia's cheek. "That's harder to answer." They spent the afternoon trying to be normal. They cooked soup, played board games, pretended the night before hadn't happened. But the silence between them wasn't the same as it used to be. It wasn't cold anymore. It was full of things unsaid, trembling beneath the surface like a fault line waiting to break. As evening settled, Amelia called them both to the couch. "We need to talk," she said in her small but serious voice. "A family meeting." She looked between them, her eyes too wise for her age. "I don't want two homes anymore. I want one. I don't want Mommy to cry when Daddy's not here, and I don't want Daddy to be sad when Mommy goes." Delphine's breath caught. "Sweetheart, it's not that simple." Amelia crossed her arms. "It is. You both still love each other." "I can feel it." The room went still. Caspian's throat closed around the truth. Delphine looked down, her fingers tightening around the edge of the couch cushion. It's complicated, she whispered. Amelia shook her head. Love shouldn't be complicated. It's supposed to make people stay. Tears slipped down Delphine's cheeks before she could stop them. Caspian moved closer, his voice rough and quiet. She's right, he said. I left when I shouldn't have. I kept thinking success would make up for what I lost. But it didn't. I've spent years trying to build something to be proud of. But none of it matters if I can't share it with you. Delphine wiped her tears but didn't look away. You think words can fix this? No, he said, his voice breaking. But maybe actions can. I can't undo what I did, but I can choose differently now. Amelia reached out and took both their hands, her tiny fingers connecting them. Then promise, she said. Promise you'll try again. Delphine looked at their daughter, then at the man who once broke her heart and somehow still held it. The silence stretched, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of something fragile, something real. She nodded slowly. One step at a time, she whispered. Caspian exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for years. He reached out, his hand covering both theirs. We start together, he said softly. Amelia smiled, satisfied, then snuggled between them and fell asleep against her mother's shoulder. The fire crackled softly, its glow reflecting in Delphine's eyes. Caspian watched her, afraid to move, afraid to lose this small, impossible piece. Delphine looked down at Amelia, her voice barely audible. Maybe she's right, she murmured. Maybe love isn't supposed to be perfect. Maybe it's just supposed to keep showing up. He smiled, his hand still in hers. Then I'll show up. Every time. Outside, the snow began to fall again, gentle this time, wrapping the world in a quiet promise. Inside, 3 hearts that had been scattered found their rhythm again. Not through grand gestures or apologies, but through the simple act of staying when it mattered most. 2 years later, the cabin looked different. The wood had darkened from the seasons, the porch railings now lined with flower boxes Amelia had planted herself, and the laughter that once felt borrowed had become part of the walls. The lake beyond the trees shimmered with early morning light, mist rising off its surface like a memory breathing new life. Caspian stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching Amelia chase their dog through the snow-dusted yard, her pink scarf fluttering behind her like a flag of victory. Inside, he could hear the faint hum of Delphine's voice singing along to a Christmas song as she flipped pancakes in the kitchen. It was the kind of sound he used to think only existed in other people's lives. He had stopped wearing suits except for rare meetings, had turned the corner office into a satellite workspace he barely used. Most days he worked from the cabin now, his schedule built around Amelia's laughter instead of market reports. There was peace in the chaos, a rhythm he'd once believed impossible. Every morning he woke before the sun and just listened to the quiet, to his family, to his own heartbeat. It still startled him sometimes how much he had changed by simply learning to stay. Delphine called from inside. Breakfast's ready. Her voice carried warmth and something else, a steadiness that hadn't been there before. He walked in, greeted by the smell of butter and maple syrup. The kitchen was filled with light, steam curling above the griddle. Delphine stood there in a simple sweater, her hair tied loosely, eyes bright from the fire's glow. She looked at him with that small, knowing smile that no longer hid behind walls. Coffee's getting cold again, she said, teasing softly. I like it that way, he replied, taking a seat. Reminds me of where I started. She raised an eyebrow. Still dramatic after all these years, he chuckled. Only for you. Amelia climbed into her chair between them, face smeared with syrup. We're still a family, right? She asked suddenly, her tone curious, not anxious. Caspian and Delphine exchanged a glance, then both smiled. Always, Delphine said, brushing a crumb from her daughter's cheek. After breakfast, Delphine's phone buzzed on the counter. Caspian glanced at the screen. Boston Children's Hospital. She followed his gaze, her smile fading slightly. For a moment, the world went quiet except for the pop of the fireplace. 2 years ago, this same moment would have torn them apart. Now it only hovered between them like a test they already knew how to pass. She reached for the phone, her fingers trembling just slightly. Caspian's voice was gentle. You don't have to prove anything anymore. Delphine hesitated, then turned the phone face down on the counter. They have other doctors, she said, though her eyes glistened. Right now I have pancakes and movie night and a promise I still mean to keep. Caspian smiled quietly, the kind that reached his eyes. You already have. The day passed softly. Snow drifted past the windows. They spent the afternoon decorating a small tree. Amelia hanging ornaments shaped like hearts and stars, each one marked with a year and a memory. By evening, the living room glowed in golden light. They sat curled together on the couch, blankets tangled, watching an old movie that none of them were really paying attention to. Halfway through, Amelia fell asleep between them, her head on her mother's shoulder, her feet resting against her father's leg. Delphine looked at her and then at Caspian, her voice a whisper. She saved us, you know. He nodded. She gave us something to fight for. Delphine smiled faintly. She reminded us what home means. On the coffee table lay a stack of mail. Caspian reached for it absent-mindedly, flipping through bills and catalogs until one envelope caught his eye. An elegant white card addressed to Dr. Delphine Montgomery. His eyes lingered on the name. She hadn't told him. She must have changed it months ago. He looked up at her, his voice quiet but full of warmth. You changed your name. Delphine looked startled for a moment, then soft. It just felt right again, she said. Like the part of my life I ran from finally caught up with me. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. You came home. She leaned closer, her head resting against his shoulder. I never really left, she whispered. Outside, the snow began again, fine and slow, blanketing the world in a gentle hush. The movie flickered on, forgotten. Caspian kissed the top of her head, his other hand still resting over Amelia's small fingers. The fire crackled low, steady and warm. He looked around the room, the same cabin where he'd once waited alone by a dying flame, and realized that everything he'd ever wanted wasn't lost after all. It had just been waiting for him to choose it. The storm that had once torn them apart had finally quieted, and in its silence love, fragile and fierce, settled into something unbreakable. The snow outside had softened into a quiet shimmer, the kind that made the air glow silver under the winter moon. The fire in the cabin burned low, its orange light flickering against the windows. Caspian sat on the couch with a book open on his lap, though he hadn't turned a page in half an hour. His eyes kept drifting to the kitchen doorway, where Delphine stood drying dishes, her movements slow, thoughtful. She wasn't rushing anymore, he noticed that. There was peace in the rhythm of her small motions, the kind that came from someone who had finally stopped running from her own heart. Amelia was upstairs, already asleep, her soft breathing faint through the wooden beams. The house was wrapped in silence, but it wasn't the kind that made the heart ache anymore. It was the kind that let you hear everything you'd once been too busy to notice. The ticking of the old clock, the whisper of the fire, the heartbeat of home. Delphine turned, wiping her hands on a towel, her hair spilling over one shoulder in loose curls. You're quiet tonight, she said, her voice low and warm. Caspian smiled faintly. Just thinking. She tilted her head, teasing gently. That sounds dangerous. He chuckled, closing the book and setting it aside. I was thinking about how this used to feel impossible. The three of us under one roof. You cooking, me pretending I can fix the fireplace, Amelia running around stealing all the blankets. Delphine walked over, sitting across from him on the edge of the armchair. We had to break first, she said softly, to learn how to rebuild right. He nodded, watching the firelight dance in her eyes. Do you ever regret it? The years we lost? She hesitated, looking down at her hands. Sometimes, she admitted. But then I look at what we have now, and I think maybe we needed that distance to understand what we almost threw away. Caspian reached out and took her hand. I'd go through it all again if it meant ending up here. Her eyes lifted to meet his, shining faintly with emotion. You really mean that? He squeezed her fingers gently. Every word. The wind outside pressed softly against the cabin walls. Somewhere in the woods an owl called out, its low cry echoing through the stillness. Delphine leaned back into the chair, her voice thoughtful. When I got that call 2 years ago, when I left that night, I thought I was choosing duty over love. But maybe I was just too scared to trust love again. You can't save others if you're too afraid to be saved yourself. Caspian's voice was quiet, rough with sincerity. You don't have to save anyone anymore. You've done enough saving for a lifetime. She looked at him, a tear slipping down her cheek before she could stop it. You're still the only person who ever saw me, Caspian. Not the doctor. Not the perfect mother. Just me. He rose slowly and crossed the small space between them, kneeling in front of her. The firelight cast shadows across his face, but his eyes were steady, filled with a gentleness that came from understanding, not longing. "And you," he said softly, "were the only one who ever made me want to be someone better." Delphine laughed quietly, wiping her tears. "You already are." He rested his forehead against hers, the world narrowing to the warmth of her breath and the sound of the fire behind them. For a long moment, neither spoke. There was no need to. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was full, alive, pulsing with all the words they'd already said without speaking. When he finally pulled back, he reached into his pocket and held out a small silver chain. A pendant glimmered at the end, a heart made of glass faintly glowing in the firelight. "It was supposed to be a Christmas gift," he said quietly, "but I never got to give it to you. Until now." Delphine stared at it, then at him, her lips parting slightly. "You kept it all this time?" "Every year," he said. "I told myself I'd throw it away, but I never could." She took it slowly, her fingers brushing his. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "You didn't have to." "I did," he said. "Because it's not just a gift. It's a reminder of what I almost lost, of what I'll never take for granted again." She slipped the chain around her neck, her fingers trembling. The pendant caught the firelight and reflected it back between them, like a quiet promise. "You really are terrible at letting go," she said, smiling through her tears. Caspian smiled back. "That's the point." Delphine reached up and touched his cheek, her thumb tracing the faint scar near his jaw. "Then don't let go," she whispered. "I won't," he said. The fire crackled softly. Snow drifted past the windows again, the world outside frozen in silence, but inside the cabin, warmth pulsed like a heartbeat. Upstairs, Amelia turned in her sleep and murmured something that sounded like laughter. Caspian and Delphine sat there, the glow of the flames between them, two souls who had found their way back through years of distance and heartbreak. The storm was over now, and in its wake, there was only the quiet strength of love that had learned, at last, how to stay. The morning light crept slowly across the wooden floorboards, sliding through the curtains in soft golden threads. Delphine stirred awake to the faint smell of coffee and the muffled clatter of dishes downstairs. For a moment she lay still, letting the warmth of the blanket and the distant hum of domestic noise sink into her bones. It was the kind of morning she used to dream about when she was alone in her apartment. A morning without urgency, without alarms, without her phone buzzing her out of bed for emergencies that had nothing to do with her own life. She sat up, brushed her hair back, and glanced toward the window. The snow outside had begun to melt, revealing glistening patches of earth beneath. Winter was breaking. The lake shimmered faintly in the distance, thin ribbons of mist rising like breath. She smiled faintly, remembering the night before, the warmth of Caspian's voice, the way his hand had lingered in hers when she thought she'd forgotten what that touch felt like. Downstairs, laughter broke the quiet. Amelia's laughter, and full, bright, unrestrained. Delphine followed the sound. In the kitchen, she found Caspian standing in front of the stove again, his hair tousled, his sleeves rolled up, trying to flip pancakes while Amelia stood beside him in her pajamas, instructing him like a tiny general. "No, Daddy, you have to wait for the bubbles first," Amelia scolded, pointing with her fork. Caspian grinned. "You've been spending too much time with your mother. You sound just like her." "I'll take that as a compliment," Delphine said, leaning against the doorframe. He turned, startled for a moment, and then his smile softened. "You're awake. Coffee's on the counter. Pancakes are, well, a work in progress." Delphine walked in, her bare feet silent on the warm wooden floor, and took the mug he'd left for her. She didn't need to ask how he knew exactly how she still liked it. Black, 2 sugars, no cream. It was a small detail, but it hit her harder than she expected. People change, but love remembers the small things. Amelia, meanwhile, had taken it upon herself to flip the next pancake. It landed half on the edge of the pan, half on the counter, but she looked immensely proud. "I did it." "You did?" Delphine said, laughing, scooping the half-burnt pancake onto a plate. "And that one's mine." They all sat down together, no schedules, no court-ordered visits, no ticking clock between them. Just the sound of a family rediscovering its rhythm. Caspian kept stealing glances at Delphine, and each time she caught him, he looked away too late. She didn't call him out for it. It felt nice, familiar, dangerous maybe, but right. When breakfast was over, Amelia dashed off to build a fort in the living room, leaving them alone in the soft aftermath of laughter and dishes. Delphine stood by the sink rinsing plates when Caspian came up beside her. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to imagine this. Not the big house or the company, just this. A morning where everything felt okay." She didn't look at him, just kept washing the plate in her hands. "You had it once." "I know," he said. "And I threw it away." The admission hung in the air, fragile and raw. She set the plate down and turned to face him. His eyes were full of that same mixture of guilt and hope she'd seen so many times before. But this time he didn't look away. "I can't change the past," he continued, his voice rough, "but I can keep showing up now. I can keep proving that this, you, her, us, it's not something I'll ever walk away from again." Delphine felt something tighten in her chest. She'd spent so long protecting herself from these words, building walls made of reason and fear. But standing here in this kitchen that smelled like coffee and syrup, watching the man who'd once broken her heart speak with such naked sincerity, she realized those walls had already begun to crumble. "Caspian," she said softly, "I don't need promises anymore. I just need consistency. I need to know that when life gets messy, and it will, you'll stay. Even when it's hard, I will," he said simply, "because I finally understand that staying is the only thing that matters." Outside, Amelia's voice echoed through the living room. "Mommy, Daddy, come see." They turned to find her standing inside a massive pillow fort draped with blankets, her face glowing with pride. "It's our castle," she announced. "But we all have to fit inside, okay? That means no fighting." Caspian laughed, grabbing a pillow. "Orders from the Queen herself." Delphine smiled as she crawled inside beside them. It was cramped, messy, full of static electricity and laughter. But when Amelia snuggled between them, resting her head on their joined hands, Delphine felt something she hadn't in years, and a deep, steady peace. As they lay there, surrounded by the quiet heartbeat of the home they'd rebuilt, Caspian whispered against the dark. "This is all I ever wanted." Delphine closed her eyes, her fingers tightening around his. "Then let's never stop choosing it." The snow outside had melted into rain, gentle and rhythmic, washing away what was left of the past. Inside the small fort made of pillows and second chances, 3 hearts beat together in the soft, unwavering truth that love, and when chosen every day, could heal anything. The rain had stopped by nightfall, leaving the world outside damp and quiet, the lake glimmering like black glass under a silver moon. Inside the cabin, the fire burned slow and steady, throwing gentle shadows that danced along the wooden walls. Delphine sat on the floor beside the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, a half-finished glass of wine resting near her hand. The room was filled with a kind of stillness she hadn't known in years, a calm that didn't come from exhaustion or duty, but from something softer, something like belonging. Caspian was in the armchair across from her, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, his face illuminated by the amber glow of the fire. Between them lay the remnants of the evening, a half-played board game, Amelia's crayon drawing scattered across the rug, a bowl of popcorn that had long gone cold. The air still smelled faintly of cinnamon and wood smoke. "She's really out?" he asked quietly, glancing toward the stairs. "Completely," Delphine said, smiling. 3 stories, 1 glass of warm milk, and a pillow fort will do that to her. He laughed softly, the sound deep and easy. "You always had the magic touch." "It's not magic," she said, swirling her wine idly. "It's just presence. Kids know when someone's really there." He looked at her then, really looked, and she felt the weight of his gaze settle on her skin. "You're right," he said. "I'm still learning that." Delphine set her glass down, the firelight catching on the rim. "You've learned more than you think," she said gently. "You've shown up, Caspian. That's more than most people ever do." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his expression shifting to something she couldn't quite read. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't left?" She hesitated, her eyes tracing the flame as it flickered and folded in on itself. "All the time," she admitted. "But I also wonder if we would have broken worse if we'd kept trying back then. Maybe we needed to fall apart to understand how to hold on." He nodded slowly, his throat working as if swallowing something heavy. "You're a better person than I am." "Not true," she said softly. "I just had more time to figure out who I was without you." That silence again. Not cold, not painful. Just full of memory of what they'd lost and what they'd rebuilt from the ruins. The fire crackled quietly. Rainwater dripped from the roof in slow, rhythmic drops. "I didn't think I'd ever get this back," Caspian said finally. "The feeling of sitting across from you and not needing to fix anything, not needing to prove anything. Just being here." Delphine's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Then stop thinking and stay here." He looked at her, eyes softening, something unspoken trembling between them. He rose slowly, crossing the small space until he was standing in front of her. When he reached out his hand, she didn't hesitate. His fingers brushed against her cheek, tracing the edge of her jaw the way they used to. Gentle, reverent, as if she were something sacred. "You haven't changed," he murmured. She smiled faintly, shaking her head. "I've changed in every way that matters." "Maybe that's why I can finally see you," he said. Her breath hitched as his thumb brushed the corner of her mouth. She could feel his pulse through his hand, fast and unsteady, mirroring her own. The years between them, all the bitterness and regret, all the cold nights of silence felt like ghosts fading into the background. What remained was the ache of recognition, the reminder that love, real love, never dies. It waits. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, her voice trembling when she spoke. "I was so angry at you for so long. I thought if I hated you enough, it would make it easier to move on." He knelt down, his forehead resting against hers. "And did it?" "No," she whispered. "It just made me forget how to breathe." He exhaled slowly, his voice breaking. "Then let me make it right, Delphine. Not with words this time, with everything I have left." Her eyes met his, and in them she saw the man she'd once loved, the man she'd lost, and the man he'd become. She didn't answer with words. She didn't need to. She leaned forward and their lips met, softly at first, a hesitant rediscovery. A question asked in silence and answered with tears. When they finally pulled apart, her hands were on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. He pressed a kiss to her forehead, his voice a whisper against her skin. "I don't deserve this. You don't have to," she said. "You just have to keep showing up." They stayed like that for a long time. Two souls who had fallen apart and found their way back not through grand gestures, but through the quiet courage of forgiveness. Upstairs, the floor creaked as Amelia turned in her sleep, her small voice drifting faintly down the stairs. "Mommy, Daddy?" Caspian smiled against Delphine's hair. "Right here, Princess," he whispered. And as they sat there in the warm glow of the fire, holding on to what they thought they'd lost forever, Delphine realized that maybe love didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to endure, and in that moment it did. Morning came softly. Like a secret the world whispered only to those who had earned its peace. The cabin was quiet, touched by the pale light of dawn. Frost glittered along the windows, and the fire from the night before had burned down to glowing embers, casting a warm heartbeat through the room. Caspian woke first, the weight of Delphine's head resting against his shoulder, her hair spilling over him like silk. For a long moment he didn't move. He simply watched the gentle rhythm of her breathing, the small crease between her brows that had softened since the night they'd found their way back to each other. He shifted slightly, pressing a kiss to her hair. She stirred, murmuring something in her sleep before nestling closer. It was still strange to him, this calm. For so many years his mornings had begun with emails, alarms, and empty silence. But now it began with her warmth, with the smell of coffee he'd soon make and the sound of Amelia's footsteps that would thunder down the stairs. He smiled to himself, a quiet contentment settling where ambition used to live. Outside the world was silver and still. The lake reflected the soft light of the rising sun, mist curling across its surface like memory. Caspian stood at the window for a moment, watching the day wake up. He could hear faint movement behind him, Delphine stretching, yawning softly, the sound of the blanket shifting. "Coffee?" he asked, turning toward her. She blinked sleepily, her voice a whisper. "You always did make the best coffee," he chuckled. "That's because I learned patience," she smiled faintly, sitting up. "You didn't used to have any." "Maybe I didn't have the right reasons to wait," he said quietly. Delphine met his gaze, something tender flickering in her expression. She rose and crossed to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. He held her there, looking out at the white morning that stretched across the lake. For a while they said nothing. There was no need. When Amelia's laughter echoed down the stairs, they both smiled. She came running into the kitchen, her hair messy, still wearing the oversized pajamas Delphine had sewn for her last Christmas.
"Snowman time,"
she announced, waving her gloves like a flag. "Breakfast first," Delphine said, laughing. "Then snowmen." The day bloomed slowly after that. They cooked together, pancakes and syrup, music humming low in the background. Caspian watched Delphine and Amelia dance between the counters, their laughter filling every corner of the home that had once been too big, too quiet. It was the kind of happiness he never thought he would touch again. Later, when the three of them stepped outside, the snow crunched beneath their boots. The cold air bit gently at their faces, their breath turning to mist. Amelia began to roll a mound of snow for the base of the snowman, her giggles echoing across the frozen yard. Delphine's cheeks were flushed, her hair falling loose from her hat. Caspian couldn't take his eyes off her. There was life in her now, not just survival, not just duty, but real, radiant life. As they finished their snowman, Amelia stepped back and declared proudly, "He needs a name." Caspian thought for a moment. "How about Mr. Second Chances?" Delphine looked at him, surprise giving way to a soft smile. "That sounds about right." They stood together in the cold, laughter and love warming them more than the layers they wore. When Amelia went inside to fetch a carrot for the snowman's nose, Caspian reached for Delphine's hand. Their fingers intertwined easily like they'd never forgotten how. "You know," he said, his voice low, "I used to believe people only got one great love in a lifetime." "And now?" she asked. "Now I know that sometimes," he said, "you get a second chance at the same one." Delphine's eyes shimmered, not from the wind, but from emotion. She leaned forward and kissed him softly, the snowflakes melting against their skin. It wasn't a kiss born of urgency or desperation. It was quiet, grounded, full of the peace that comes after a storm. When they went back inside, warmth met them like an embrace. The fire was burning again, the scent of pine wood and cinnamon thick in the air. On the coffee table lay a single white envelope that had arrived with the morning mail. Delphine picked it up absently and opened it, her eyes scanning the neat handwriting. A small smile curved her lips as she handed it to Caspian. Inside was a thank you note from the family of the little boy she had operated on 2 years ago, the night she had left him at the cabin to save a stranger. It was written in careful, grateful words, ending with a line that caught his breath. "Please thank Dr. Delphine Montgomery for saving our son. We will never forget her." He looked at her, eyes soft. "You changed it back." She nodded, her smile gentle. It felt like time to stop running from the name that always meant home. Caspian reached for her, his voice quiet and steady. "You came home?" She placed a hand against his chest, over his heart. "I never really left, Caspian. I was just waiting for us to find our way back." Outside, the snow began again, drifting slow and silent. Inside, laughter returned, the kind that comes only when the heart is light. Amelia danced around their legs, humming her own tune, while Delphine and Caspian stood hand in hand, watching the fire. It wasn't perfection that filled the room. It was something far better. It was peace. It was presence. It was love that had been broken, healed, and made stronger in the cracks. And as the snow fell over the cabin and the lake beyond, they knew that this time they were finally home for good.